Okay, folks, so we know that oil and energy prices are skyrocketing everywhere, and it's increasingly hurting citizens, average everyday citizens of literally every country. As prices go up, so do the prices of transportation, so do the prices of goods and services, the overall cost of living. Even in economies like the US that export more oil than they import, at least as of the last couple of years, while energy prices are still influenced dramatically by the global supply. If global supply is crunching or global demand is expanding, well, prices everywhere go up. If demand is going up in Europe or Asia, that impacts the global price and hurts even domestic prices. So in that sense, every single time oil and energy go up, it's a huge windfall for producers and exporters, but also a huge downfall for consumers and countries as a whole that rely heavily on those commodities. If you look at the top producers of oil, it's usually the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. If you look at the top producers of natural gas, it's usually the US, Russia, and Iran. You look at the top producers of energy as a whole, it's usually China, the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. Now you look at the biggest exporters of oil, ones that have a lot of excess oil to export, you almost always have Saudi Arabia and Russia as number one and number two respectively. And then you go to natural gas, you usually almost always have Russia as number one. So it's obvious that those who produce the most and export the most are also the ones that benefit the most when prices go up. Okay, so let's go ahead and back up for a second. Why are oil prices specifically going up right now? Well, the first reason is that we just came off a period of dramatic shutdowns where oil demand was reduced to basically nothing. But then as the pandemic went on and people got back to work and economies reopened, demand soared back dramatically. However, production of those energy sources lagged demand quite a bit. Now that's the context, but it doesn't explain the recent huge increases in the last couple of weeks. The reason that it's gone parabolic as of late is because of the Russia-Ukraine situation. Traders are trying to factor in the risk of Russia being cut off from the global supply chain, which of course is one of the biggest exporters and suppliers on the global supply chain. Thus, prices have been rallying dramatically, even though Western sanctions have been very, very careful to avoid sanctioning or hitting directly the energy segment. So who actually benefits from oil and gas in these big oil and gas countries? Well, in the US, it's individual shareholders, mutual funds, big index funds, anyone who is holding shares in companies like ExxonMobil or Chevron. But in Russia, it's a completely different story. Check this out. You look at the top Russian oil and natural gas companies. Number one, you have Gazprom, which is the world's largest natural gas company, a major supplier to Europe. Who owns it and reaps the profits? Well, the shareholder structure of this company is about 38% owned by the Russian Federation and about 11% owned by Owns Rosneft Gas. Owns Rosneft Gas, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing completely accurately, is a holding company owned by whom? Well, the Russian government via the Federal Agency for State Property Management. So now you've got about 50% of this company owned by the Russian government. And as of the other shareholders, most of them are Russian leadership loyalists. The next one is Rosneft itself. Who owns Rosneft? Well, again, of course, the Rosneft Gas holding company, which we showed again is 100% owned by the Russian government. 19.75% of it was owned by BP, but they announced they'll be dumping their shares. And who will they be selling their Rosneft shares to? Well, back to Rosneft. Now, those are the two biggest companies. And if you look at a list of Russia's oil and gas companies, most of them are either these two companies, subsidiaries of these two companies, or are controlled in some way, shape, or form by the Russian government or Russian government affiliates and or oligarchs. If it's energy in Russia, the Russian government controls it and profits off it. Even Interea, which is the nation's domestic energy player, is owned by a fancy assortment of Russian state-backed enterprises. So in Russia, obviously, it's largely the government and government affiliates who control the energy and energy production and get all the energy profits, which is a lot because, again, that's the main export in Russia. This isn't a secret, and obviously it was done intentionally after the fall of the Soviet Union and the conversion to an attempted market economy. The federal government did not want to relinquish their main asset, which is their natural resources. So they retained control of it and basically built their entire country on it over the last couple of decades. Previously to the fall of the Soviet Union, you had a much more diverse economy with manufacturing being very, very heavy, with a ton of different sectors developing and providing huge trading opportunities. But after the fall, almost all of the industries fell, and a lot of the Soviet Socialist Republic states that broke off took a lot of the economic diversification away from what was left of Russia. But Russia still maintained very, very strong status as a major worldwide superpower in terms of oil and gas production, which is something that you probably already know, but what you may not know is just how much Russia depends on this segment. In most countries, you have a diversity of different sectors, which provides a lot of opportunities for the country to be stable. But in Russia, oil and gas accounted for 60% of Russia's exports and 39% of its federal budget in 2019. That means that when prices go up, the Russian economy has a huge windfall and the government has a lot more revenue to spend. But when prices go down, Russia gets bludgeoned, the economy slows down dramatically, and the government has a massive deficit, which is partially why Russia's economy has struggled to grow consistently over the last couple of decades, despite a lot of European counterparts growing very dramatically and consistently. And of course, the US growth being dramatic over the last 20 years as well. And again, that's because their economy is dependent on the prices of oil and gas. If you look at the trajectory of their GDP over the last 20 years, it follows very closely the trajectory of oil prices over the last 20 years. And that's not a coincidence. And the reason that Russia's economy grew so fast last year is because energy prices bounced dramatically off of 2020's levels. Last year, crude oil hit several year highs, giving Russia a huge windfall in both government money, but also in terms of GDP. Russia then spends a lot of the oil and gas money that they make in things like defense, military spending, which they then use to go and invade countries like, say, Ukraine, which is pretty crazy considering where Russia is getting this money from, where they're selling oil and gas to. It's many of the same countries that are sanctioning Russia, but they have inadvertently helped fund Russia's invasion. And obviously this isn't a surprise, and you've heard this before in other parts of the world, but you have to understand this problem to really understand Russia's upper hand in some of these areas. Huge sanctions have been hitting Russia from all over the world. You've seen huge resistance to Russia's invasion, and thankfully so. But you haven't seen anything except for indirect speculation that suggests any sort of cutting off of the energy source, the most important driver of government revenue and of economic value in that entire country. You did see some pausing and delaying of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which wasn't activated yet anyways. But overall, the flows that were happening into Europe and the rest of the world are still happening just like they were 6 months ago or 3 years ago. And obviously that's because countries don't want to cut off their energy sources. It makes total sense. They're going to screw their citizens over, and citizens are going to have to pay out the ear and out the rear end for extremely high energy prices. And they already were kind of doing that before this whole Russia thing even happened. And while Western countries have made it clear that they don't want to cut off energy sources, the simple fear that they made down the road is creating this dynamic where energy prices are going up more and more, which of course means that the powerhouse of Russia, oil and gas, is becoming more and more lucrative, helping soften the blow of a lot of other Russian sanctions that are hitting the country. While Russian everyday citizens are getting screwed and their pricing power is getting killed, oil and gas prices are continuing to skyrocket, which is giving a huge windfall to oil and gas oligarchs, which own a lot of these companies, and also the Russian government, which then can be used to further fund military operations in these regions. Meanwhile, Western countries don't really have any better options of what to hit them with. Obviously, boots on the ground could trigger a World War III. Not trying to punish them via some sanctions is going to cause them to be more encouraged to do more aggressive actions. And at the end of the day, if you really want to hurt Russia, you do have to cut off that energy supply. And at the same time, if your rhetoric suggests that you may cut it off down the road, or you make any movement that suggests that you might, well, that causes prices to go up dramatically before you even do that, which further enriches the Russian government and, of course, oligarchs in that region. Now, when you start seeing the most recent escalations in regards to SWIFT and international payment transfers, it's probably true that you will see some complications roll out in the energy segment as well. But for the most part, when the global supply chain relies very heavily on one country, and that one country is a huge aggressor right now, that causes a huge disaster for everybody involved, and it's a damn shame. Now, it's very important to understand this, but what gets very interesting is what a lot of people don't know. There's a phenomenal video done by Real Life Lore, which is another YouTube channel. It's about 30 minutes long, highly recommend it. We'll link to it below. But essentially, they showcase the extreme strategic importance of Ukraine to Russia, outside of some obvious incentives for invading, like rebuilding the Soviet Union or preventing Ukraine from joining NATO. There's also the truth that Russia has had to pay huge tariffs to Ukraine to transport their energy and gas to Europe via pipelines under Ukraine. Seizing Ukraine would allow for it to save substantial amounts of money on tariffs and percentages of the biggest export of Russia. Number two, and this is where it gets really interesting, recent research has shown that it's possible that Ukraine actually might have the world's 14th largest reserves of natural gas, which would threaten the amount of dependence that Europe has on Russia for these segments, which of course is a segment that Russia depends very heavily on to fund everything that they operate on. In fact, it was found that the area around Crimea and the coastline of Ukraine may contain over 2 trillion tons of natural gas, and then the area areas around Donetsk and Kharkiv in the east with the border along Russia, and in the west around the other border contain resources like shale gas. Now, Ukraine hasn't had a ton of money to actually develop infrastructure to exploit and sell off these resources and generate revenue for their government and their economy. And because Ukraine's leaders in the past have been more pro-Russian, Russia didn't have much threat of competition from Ukraine in these segments. But then that all changed. You had some movements in the country which led to less pro-Russian leadership and the acceptance of foreign investments and selling of drilling rights to companies like Shell, which, if allowed to go on, could have allowed Ukraine to become a massive superpower in the European natural gas and oil market, threatening a lot of the market share of the supreme leader of that segment, which is right now Russia. But then what happened? Well, by invading Crimea, Russia gained control of up to 80% of Ukraine's offshore drilling capabilities, 2/3 of Ukraine's coastline, and seized billions of dollars of infrastructure investment on that peninsula, which scared away further foreign investment and anybody else that was interested in buying drilling rights, and essentially crippled Ukraine's ability to actually benefit from these natural resources that are in its country. Worse yet, the other areas here and here are also near Russian-funded conflict zones, which are highlighted in red, which also have made it very, very impossible to get foreign investment. Investors don't want to invest in an area that is disputed, has the potential of being war-torn, or anything that could lead to the confiscation of their investment or the destruction of their investment. So again, another opportunity for Russia to completely screw the natural resource harvesting capabilities of Ukraine. Think about this. If Ukraine had access to its main ports, its full coastline, and foreign investment to actually drill for its natural resources, it would have not only gotten a lot stronger, both militarily and economically, and been even more able to fight off Russian invasions, but it also would have been an obvious candidate for membership to the EU. Ukraine, instead of being a pass-through country for energy supplies, would have become a main source of energy supply in the European region, which would dramatically have reduced the amount of reliance that European countries and the global economy had on Russia, and decreased the political risk associated with that, like funding adverse military goals. So Russia made sure that didn't happen by arming and funding separatist groups around areas where Ukraine was rich in natural resources, and by annexing an entire peninsula, which made Ukraine incredibly potentially competitive in the overall global economy, ensuring that Ukraine never becomes a big threat to Russia, and ensuring that it's easy to conquer if Russia deems it necessary. There's no shortage of incentives. There's no shortage of strategic advantages to having that region under your control. But understanding the role of oil and gas is also incredibly crucial for understanding how sensitive and interconnected this situation is right now. The global supply of energy and gas is just that. It's global, which means that all countries, even countries like the US, who barely import anything in terms of energy products from Russia, are hugely impacted because global prices that average everyday citizens in every country pay are based on the global economy, which means whether we like it or not, one of the main forms of leverage that Russia has is that oil and gas segment. As long as they have that, it's very, very difficult for the West to really crack down effectively without causing mutual destruction. Russia depends on oil and gas to run its entire country. The world depends on Russia's oil and gas to provide oil and gas at affordable prices to its citizens. Over the long run, as we switch to more and more greener forms of energy, there should be a lot more diversity, and countries that are mainly focused on producing oil and gas are going to see less and less revenues come from that, and thus we're going to have less and less power. But as of right now, we're still in the thick of it, and prices are on a track where they may hit new all-time highs, causing problems all around the world. So anyways, folks, I hope I gave you a new perspective on the situation, and I hope I encouraged you to learn a little bit more about the dynamics that connect all the different countries. I think that a lot of people don't really understand how we are connected to different economies, even ones that we don't directly trade with, and they may not also understand what the overall economic incentive is for countries that are very, very commodity driven. And hopefully this explained it a little bit. Anyways, that caps off this video. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us below or join us on ZipTrader Circle. If you'd like to learn how to trade with our step-by-step lessons, daily morning briefings, as well as our full price targets, I'll go ahead and put a link to ZipTrader you below. I'll put a little coupon code down there if you are interested, but have a good one. If you enjoyed this video, hit that ravishing like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.